Breaking news from Ottawa that's sending shockwaves through Washington. President Trump just got hit with a reality check he didn't see coming, and it's all about energy. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney just delivered a crushing blow to Trump's desperate plea for LNG relief. And the answer wasn't just no. It was a complete strategic dismantling of America's leverage over its northern neighbor. Here's what's happening. Trump, facing mounting pressure from his own energy demands and tariff blowback, reached out to Canada requesting relief on liquefied natural gas exports. Carney's response? A strategic pivot to Asia that's leaving the United States in the cold, literally and figuratively. Today, we're breaking down three critical developments. First, the stunning collapse of Canadian energy flows to the U.S. Second, Carney's $116 billion nation-building alternative that bypasses America entirely. And third, the geopolitical earthquake this creates for Trump's 2026 agenda. Let's dive in. So what exactly just happened? Let me lay this out clearly because the mainstream media is burying the most important details. On January 10, 2026, Canada shipped its first ever large-scale LNG cargo directly to Asia from the Kitimat facility in British Columbia, a $40 billion project over a decade in the making. The tanker Gaslog Glasgow departed for South Korea, marking Canada's official entry as a major LNG exporter to Asian markets. This wasn't just symbolic, it was the beginning of a massive energy realignment. But here's where it gets worse for the Trump administration. Canadian natural gas exports to the United States have collapsed. According to data released just 2 days ago by Industrial Info Resources, Canadian gas flows averaged 9 billion cubic feet per day in January 2025. As of last Friday, that number had plummeted to just 5.4 billion cubic feet per day, a drop of 40% in less than a year. Let me give you those numbers again because they're staggering. Canada went from sending 9 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day to America, down to 5.4 billion. That's not a minor adjustment. That's a strategic withdrawal from the U.S. market. Meanwhile, Statistics Canada reported that the total value of Canadian energy exports in October 2025 was down 12.4% year over year. Heavy crude oil exports, where Canada is the largest supplier to the United States, providing 4 million barrels per day, or 60% of all foreign oil deliveries, dropped in value by nearly 19%. And it gets worse. This collapse is happening while Trump's tariff war with Canada continues to escalate. The president imposed 35% tariffs on most Canadian goods back in August 2025, with energy products facing a 10% levy. Trump's strategy was clear. Use tariffs as leverage to extract concessions from Canada on border security, trade terms, and energy supply. But Carney called his bluff. Instead of capitulating, Canada's Prime Minister announced a deliberate strategy to cut U.S. trade in half over the next 10 years. And he's backing it up with the most aggressive energy diversification plan in Canadian history, one that's already operational and generating revenue from Asian markets Trump can't control. Let's break down the mechanisms of what Carney is doing here, because this is textbook economic counter-leverage, and it's brilliant in its execution. The centerpiece is LNG Canada's Kitimat facility, the cleanest LNG facility of its kind in the world, with emissions 35% lower than the best-performing global facilities. The project is backed by Shell, Petronas, PetroChina, Mitsubishi, and Korea Gas Corporation. These aren't small players. This is a consortium of global energy giants that collectively represent massive Asian demand. Here's the critical data point. LNG Canada's first phase has a capacity to export 14 million tons of liquefied natural gas annually. Phase 2, which investors are expected to greenlight in 2026, would double that to 28 million tons per year. To put that in perspective, that's equivalent to roughly 3.7 billion cubic feet per day at full capacity, a significant portion of what Canada was previously sending to the United States. But Carney didn't stop there. In November 2025, he announced a second tranche of what he calls nation-building projects through Canada's Major Projects Office. These 7 projects, combined with 5 announced in September, represent $116 billion in investment. Among them, the Hpoe LNG facility, which would become Canada's second largest LNG export terminal, with capacity to export 12 million tons annually, all destined for Asian markets. Let me make the economic comparison crystal clear. Canada currently exports approximately 8.6 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day to the United States. But with LNG Canada operational and Hpoe projected to come online, Canada can redirect massive volumes to Asia, where prices are often 30 to 40% higher than North American markets. Why does this matter so much to Trump? Because U.S. natural gas demand is climbing fast. According to the Energy Information Administration, U.S. dry natural gas production will average 109.1 billion cubic feet per day in 2026, only a 1.3% increase from 2025. That's a significant slowdown from the 4.3% annual increase seen from 2024 levels. Translation: American production growth is slowing right when demand from data centers, AI computing, and LNG export terminals is accelerating. The United States has its own LNG export boom underway, with facilities in Texas and Louisiana ramping up. But here's the kicker. Those facilities need feedstock gas, and they compete with domestic industrial users, power plants, and consumers for supply. When Canada pulls back its 9 billion cubic feet per day of exports, that creates upward pressure on U.S. natural gas prices. Henry Hub natural gas prices, the U.S. benchmark, are forecast by the EIA to average $3.90 per million BTU in 2026, up substantially from near $2 in 2024. Bloomberg forecasts even higher, projecting prices around $4.50 to $5 by the end of 2025. Some of that price pressure is directly attributable to reduced Canadian imports. Now, let's talk about the historical precedent here. This situation mirrors the 1970s oil shocks, but in reverse. Back then, Middle Eastern producers used supply cuts as geopolitical leverage against Western nations. Now, Canada, America's largest trading partner and historically its most reliable energy supplier, is using supply diversification as leverage against Trump's tariff threats. The cause and effect chain is straightforward. Trump imposed 35% tariffs on Canadian goods. Canada responded by fast-tracking LNG export infrastructure to Asia. Asian buyers, desperate for stable natural gas supplies after Russia's energy weaponization in Europe, signed long-term contracts. Canadian producers now have more profitable alternative markets. U.S. leverage evaporates. To make this accessible with an analogy, imagine you've been buying groceries from your neighbor for years at a discount because it's convenient for both of you. Then you start demanding they also mow your lawn for free, threatening to stop buying groceries if they refuse. Instead of giving in, your neighbor opens a farm stand that attracts customers from across town willing to pay full price, even premium prices, for the same groceries. Suddenly, you're the one who needs them more than they need you. That's exactly what's happened here. The technical details matter too. The Coastal GasLink pipeline, a 670-kilometer system, connects Western Canada's natural gas fields to the Kitimat terminal. This infrastructure bypasses the traditional south-flowing pipelines that feed the U.S. market. It's a physical manifestation of Canada's strategic pivot. The gas literally flows west to Asia instead of south to America. Let's talk about who gets hit by this seismic shift, because the consequences are already rippling across multiple sectors. American workers and families are going to feel this in their energy bills. Natural gas heats 47% of American homes. When Canadian imports drop by 40% and domestic prices rise, as EIA forecasts show, that translates directly to higher heating costs. A family in Michigan or Minnesota using natural gas for heating could see their winter energy bills jump 25 to 30% in 2026 compared to 2024 levels. That's not speculation, that's math based on current price projections. And for families already stretched by inflation, an extra $50 to $100 per month in heating costs during winter months is painful. Manufacturing workers face a different threat. Natural gas is a critical feedstock for chemicals, plastics, fertilizers, and steel production. Companies like Dow Chemical and ExxonMobil Chemical have massive petrochemical complexes along the Gulf Coast that rely on cheap natural gas. When prices rise from $2 to $4 per million BTU, profit margins compress. Some facilities become uneconomical to operate. That leads to production cuts, reduced shifts, and ultimately layoffs. Small businesses, particularly in energy-intensive industries, are getting squeezed from both sides. Take a realistic case study. A small metal fabrication shop in Ohio that employs 35 people and uses natural gas for heating and some manufacturing processes. The owner, let's call him Mike, saw his natural gas costs double from 2024 to early 2026. His profit margin evaporated. He can't easily pass those costs to customers because larger competitors have locked in older contracts. Mike now faces a choice: cut staff, reduce hours, or close entirely. Multiply Mike's story by thousands of small manufacturers across the Midwest and industrial Northeast. Large corporations are reacting with alarm. Industrial conglomerates like Nucor Corporation and U.S. Steel have flagged natural gas price volatility as a significant risk factor in recent earnings calls. U.S. Steel specifically noted in its Q4 2025 earnings report that reduced Canadian energy imports create pricing uncertainty that threatens competitiveness of domestic production. Meanwhile, utility companies are scrambling. Duke Energy and Southern Company both announced in late 2025 that they're accelerating renewable energy projects specifically because natural gas price forecasts make those investments more economically attractive. That sounds positive until you realize the transition timeline. Renewable capacity takes years to build, meaning higher natural gas prices persist in the interim. International partners, particularly in Europe, are watching closely. Germany's chancellor specifically mentioned in a December 2025 speech that North American energy market instability reminds us why diversification of supply sources remains critical. That's diplomatic speak for. Europe can't rely on the US-Canada energy relationship staying stable when Trump's tariffs are destabilizing it. Expert warnings have been piling up. On January 5th, 2026, Eurasia Group published its Top Risks 2026 report specifically addressing Canada-US relations. The key quote, "Carney will struggle to sell the kind of concessions on market access or defense purchases that Trump could tout as a win. While Carney's diversification strategy carries its own risks, Trump's tariff approach has accelerated rather than prevented Canada's pivot away from U.S. dependence." Energy economist Philip Verlager, who accurately predicted oil price shocks in 2008, warned in a January 2026 analysis. The U.S. is sleepwalking into a situation where its most reliable energy partner has structurally reduced its dependency on American markets. This will create price volatility and supply constraints that tariffs cannot solve. The ripple effects extend into politics. Governors in natural gas-consuming states, including the Republican governors of Ohio and Pennsylvania, have privately expressed frustration to the White House that Trump's tariff strategy is backfiring in ways that hurt their constituents. The expert community is converging on a stark assessment. Trump's leverage over Canada has fundamentally shifted, and not in America's favor. Mark Carney himself made the strategic calculation explicit in a November 13, 2025 statement. "We are realizing Canada's full potential as an energy superpower. These nation-building projects represent more than $116 billion in investment and will position Canada for long-term prosperity in global markets. Notice the phrase global markets, not North American markets. That's deliberate messaging. Deloitte's January 2026 economic outlook for Canada specifically noted Canada will maintain a status quo trade relationship with the United States in 2026 as progress on government-backed infrastructure projects continues to accelerate diversification away from U.S. dependency. Deloitte projects Canadian GDP growth of 1.5% in 2026, down slightly from 1.7% in 2025, but crucially, that growth is increasingly driven by non-U.S. trade. Here's where the legal and economic implications get serious. Trump imposed tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, claiming a national security emergency. Federal courts have ruled those tariffs illegal, but they remained in effect through late 2025 while under appeal. The legal uncertainty created exactly the outcome Trump didn't want. It convinced Canadian policymakers that U.S. trade policy was unreliable and that diversification wasn't just smart, it was existential. The political reactions have been revealing. Republican Senator from Alaska, Lisa Murkowski, publicly criticized Trump's approach in a December 2025 statement. "We cannot tariff our way to energy security. Canada is our ally, not our adversary, and treating them like China makes no strategic sense." Meanwhile, Democratic lawmakers seized on the issue. Senate Majority Leader pushed through a resolution in October 2025 attempting to block Trump's Canada tariffs under the Congressional Review Act. It passed the Senate but stalled in the House. Still, the vote demonstrated bipartisan concern that Trump's strategy was backfiring. Let's map out the short-term effects over the next 30 to 90 days. First, Canadian LNG shipments to Asia will ramp up significantly. LNG Canada is bringing its second processing unit online, which will double capacity to 2 billion cubic feet per day by March 2026. Second, U.S. natural gas prices will continue climbing through the winter heating season. Third, pressure on Trump from manufacturing states will intensify as energy-intensive industries feel the squeeze. The medium-term scenario over 6 to 12 months is even more consequential. Canada will finalize long-term LNG supply contracts with Japanese and South Korean buyers, locking in volumes that would have otherwise been available to the U.S. market. The Kasai Leesoms LNG project will receive its final investment decision, cementing another 12 million tons per year of export capacity aimed at Asia. And politically, U.S.-Canada trade relations will remain strained heading into the 2026 midterm elections, with Democrats using high energy costs as a campaign issue in Midwest swing states. Let's recap the three most critical points. Canadian natural gas exports to the U.S. have collapsed by 40% as Carney pivots to Asian LNG markets. Trump's tariff strategy, intended to extract concessions, instead accelerated Canada's $116 billion infrastructure plan to permanently reduce dependence on American buyers. And the result is higher U.S. energy costs, lost leverage, and a strategic defeat that will echo for years. Here's the key takeaway. When you weaponize trade against your closest ally and most reliable energy partner, don't be surprised when they find other customers willing to pay more and cause fewer headaches. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think Trump underestimated Carney's resolve, or was this strategic blunder inevitable given the tariff approach? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to stay informed on stories the mainstream media won't fully cover, make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell icon. These are the kinds of economic and geopolitical shifts that determine winners and losers in the next decade, and you need to see them coming. Trump asked for LNG relief. Carney delivered a strategic redirection that fundamentally rewrites North American energy dynamics. And that's not a negotiation, that's a power shift. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.